The alarm on my wrist device screamed before I even understood why. I was Cheska Verne, third-ranked negotiator of the Thessian Concord, and in that instant, I felt the deck of our flagship tremble beneath my feet for the first time in 40 days of perfect, unbroken silence. Something had changed. Something had ended. And I did not yet know that the ending had a name, and that name was General Elena Marlowe. Let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand how quietly disaster can announce itself. 3 months earlier, our fleet arrived at the edge of a small human colony called Kepler's Rest. We expected an easy conquest. Humanity was young, barely 3 centuries into space travel, scattered across a handful of worlds, poorly armed by Concord standards. Our War Council had studied every human conflict on record and concluded that this species, while resourceful, was predictable, emotional, prone to mistakes born of anger and fear. I was sent as part of the negotiation team, tasked with the polite work of convincing the humans that surrender was their only reasonable choice. I had done this 11 times before, on 11 other worlds. I knew the rhythm of it. Threaten gently. Offer false comfort. Wait for despair to do the rest. I did not expect to meet someone like her. The first time I saw General Elena Marlowe, she was standing alone at the center of a wide, undecorated room, without armor, without a weapon, without a single guard beside her. Behind her, through the wide viewport, I could see her fleet holding position in the dark, silent and still, like predators that had already decided not to blink first. She did not smile. She did not scowl. She simply looked at each of us as we entered, one by one, the way a person studies a puzzle they already know how to solve, but are still curious to watch unfold. I remember thinking, foolishly, that she looked tired. Human eyes carry shadows easily, and hers were deep. I mistook that tiredness for weakness. I would spend the next 40 days, slowly, painfully, learning how wrong I was. Our high emissary, a stiff and self-assured Thessian named Doran Kell, opened the talks with our usual approach. He spoke of inevitability. He spoke of the size of our fleet, the strength of our weapons, the futility of resistance. He offered her colony continued existence in exchange for total submission. It was the same speech that had ended 11 other wars before they truly began. General Marlowe listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she folded her hands on the table and said only this: "Is that everything?" Doran Kell blinked, clearly expecting fear, or anger, or desperate bargaining. Instead, he received 4 quiet words that told him nothing and everything at once. I watched his composure falter, just slightly, just enough for me to notice. I do not think anyone else in the room did. That was the first crack. I did not understand yet that it was a crack. I thought it was simply strange human behavior, an oddity to note in my reports and forget by evening. I was wrong about that too. Over the following days, I found myself assigned to the smaller working sessions, the tedious back and forth of supply routes, troop movements, colonial boundaries, all the dull administrative work that surrounds any large negotiation. It was in these sessions that I spent the most time near General Marlowe, and it was here that I began to notice things I could not explain. She asked questions, many questions, about our fleet's refueling schedule, about which battle groups patrolled which sectors, about how quickly reinforcements could arrive from Concord space if talks broke down. At the time, I believed she was simply anxious, trying to understand the shape of the threat she faced. It seemed reasonable, even wise. I remember telling my colleagues that the human commander was thorough, perhaps overly cautious, but not especially dangerous. I want you to remember that I said that. I want you to remember how confident I was. Each evening, after the sessions ended, I would return to my quarters aboard our flagship and record my observations for the Concord War Council. I wrote that human morale seemed low. I wrote that the colony's defenses appeared minimal, unchanged, unimproved. I wrote that General Marlowe's calm demeanor was likely a mask for fear, a common human trait when facing overwhelming odds. I was measuring her by every version of humanity I had studied before. I did not yet understand that she was not like the others. I did not understand that patience, in the right hands, can be sharper than any weapon we had ever built. On the 7th day, something small happened that I dismissed too quickly. A supply convoy of ordinary human cargo ships requested passage through a disputed boundary near the colony. citing the need to move food and medical goods between settlements. It was a mundane request. Our logistics officers approved it without much thought, eager to appear generous during the talks. I remember General Marlowe thanking them with a simple nod, nothing more. I did not think of it again for weeks. On the 12th day, a minor territorial dispute arose between two human settlements over mining rights. It seemed almost comic in its pettiness, compared to the larger war looming over all of us. General Marlowe requested a short recess to address it personally, apologizing for the inconvenience. Doran Kell granted the request, pleased at what he saw as evidence of human disorganization, proof that they were too busy squabbling among themselves to mount any real resistance. I remember feeling almost sorry for her that day. I remember thinking that a species divided against itself could never survive what was coming. I did not know that the dispute was resolved within hours. I did not know that the ships involved in it never returned to their stated ports. I did not know, because I did not think to ask, and she never volunteered anything more than exactly what was required. That was the pattern I failed to see. Every question I answered for her, she absorbed without reaction. Every small request she made, however trivial it appeared, moved some piece across a board only she could see. And every day that passed without violence, I grew more certain that we were witnessing the slow, quiet surrender of a frightened people. I was so certain. I was so wrong. There is a particular kind of danger that does not announce itself with anger or with threats. It sits quietly across the table from you, asking polite questions, taking careful notes, thanking you for your time. It waits. And when I finally understood what General Elena Marlowe had been building during those 40 days of talks, I understood that we had not been negotiating with a frightened colony at all. We had been negotiating with a storm that had not yet decided to break. But I am ahead of myself. Before I can tell you what she built and what it cost us, I must tell you about the days that followed, the long, grinding weeks where nothing seemed to happen, and everything, quietly, was falling into place. There is one memory from those early days I want to share before moving forward, because it explains something about how completely we misjudged what we were facing. On the 20th day, before the pattern of 40 had even reached its midpoint, a junior member of our delegation, a nervous young Thessian named Farrell Osa, made the mistake of raising his voice during a routine session, frustrated by what he saw as endless human stalling. He accused General Marlowe directly of cowardice, of hiding behind polite words while too frightened to either surrender or fight. The room went quiet, in a way I had not experienced before. I expected her to respond with anger, or perhaps with the wounded pride I had seen in human commanders on other worlds when their courage was questioned. Instead, she looked at Farrell Osa for a long moment and said only, "You may believe whatever helps you sleep at night." She did not raise her voice. She did not ask for an apology. She simply returned her attention to the documents in front of her, as though the accusation had cost her nothing at all. Farrell Osa was reassigned off the delegation within the week, not because of any punishment from our side, but because his own confidence had been so thoroughly unsettled by her lack of reaction that he became useless in further sessions. I remember thinking, at the time, that this was proof of Thessian nerves breaking under the strange, patient pressure of human diplomacy. I understand now that it was something else entirely. It was the first clear sign that insults slid past her without leaving any mark, because her attention was already fixed on a plan the rest of us could not see. The days blurred together after that, each one nearly identical to the last, and it was in that sameness that I made my greatest mistake. I mistook repetition for stagnation. I mistook her patience for exhaustion. I want to walk you through those 40 days now, because every single one of them mattered, and I did not understand that until it was far too late. By the 15th day, our high emissary Doran Kell had grown restless. He was a Thessian of old habits, accustomed to negotiations that broke quickly, either through capitulation or through a swift and decisive military strike. 40 days without either outcome offended something deep in his nature. He began pushing harder, introducing new demands each session, testing to see what might finally provoke a reaction from General Marlowe. He demanded access to human shipyards for inspection. She agreed, calmly, and provided escorted tours of facilities that I now understand were carefully chosen, carefully emptied of anything meaningful before our inspectors arrived. At the time, we recorded the shipyards as underdeveloped, primitive, offering little threat. I filed that report myself, certain of its accuracy. He demanded the names and ranks of every officer in her command structure. She provided them, along with detailed biographies that painted a picture of an ordinary, unremarkable military, filled with career officers and conscripted volunteers. I did not think to question why so much information was given so freely. A frightened species trying to appear cooperative, I told myself. A people hoping that transparency might earn them mercy. He demanded she reduce her fleet's readiness level, moving ships further from the contested boundary, as a gesture of good faith. She agreed to this as well, and Concord scouts confirmed that several human vessels did indeed withdraw to distant orbits, exactly as promised. What none of us understood, not then, was that withdrawal is not the same as absence. Ships that vanish from your sensors do not cease to exist. They simply go somewhere you are not looking. I spent my evenings during this period speaking with a young Thessian analyst named Vess Oren, who had been assigned to study human communication patterns. Vess was sharper than most of our delegation, and one night, over a shared meal in the flagship's officer hall, he said something that unsettled me deeply, though I did not admit it at the time. She repeats herself, Vess said, staring at a data slate filled with transcripts of the day's session. Every question she asks, she has asked before, in a different way. She is not gathering new information. She is confirming old information. Confirming what? I asked him. Vess shook his head slowly. I do not know yet, but I do not think it is fear driving these questions. Fear does not organize itself this neatly. I dismissed his concerns that night, though I remembered them later, when it was too late for the memory to help either of us. On the 22nd day, something occurred that should have alarmed us far more than it did. A routine Concord supply vessel, moving between two of our support stations near the colony, reported a brief and unexplained sensor anomaly, a shadow on their scanners that appeared and disappeared within seconds. The vessel's crew logged it as a malfunction, likely caused by stellar interference, and continued on their route without further incident. I read that report the following morning. I remember thinking nothing of it at all. There were more such anomalies over the following 2 weeks. A patrol ship reported an unusual gap in long-range communications, lasting several minutes. A logistics officer noted that fuel consumption estimates for a nearby supply depot seemed slightly higher than expected, though not enough to raise any formal concern. A junior scanning officer aboard one of our escort vessels logged a brief, unexplained energy signature near the outer edge of the contested boundary, then dismissed it in his own report as a probable equipment fault, since nothing similar appeared on any follow-up scan. Another crew reported losing track of a civilian transport for nearly an hour before it reappeared, apparently unharmed, on its expected course, its captain offering only a vague explanation about a navigational error caused by local stellar debris. Each incident, taken alone, was meaningless. Each incident, taken alone, was exactly what General Marlowe needed us to believe. I have since learned, from records recovered after the battle, that every one of those small anomalies corresponded to the precise movement of a human vessel being repositioned toward its eventual place in the coming engagement. Each gap in our sensors carefully timed, each vague explanation carefully rehearsed. It was not luck that allowed her fleet to move so completely unnoticed. It was the accumulated discipline of hundreds of individual officers, each trained to offer exactly enough explanation to satisfy our curiosity and nothing more. I did not connect these threads until much later, when a captured human engineer, speaking freely during a debrief long after the fighting had ended, explained what those weeks had truly contained. Small, quiet redeployments. Civilian ships repurposed under emergency wartime authority, moved gradually, one or two at a time, never enough to draw attention, always explained by some mundane and plausible reason. Colonial disputes that were never really disputes at all, but cover stories for battle groups shifting position under the guise of local conflict resolution. Supply convoys that carried far more than food and medicine. All of it happening in plain sight, while we sat across a table from the woman orchestrating it, congratulating ourselves on how easily she answered our questions. By the 30th day, I began to notice a change in General Marlowe's manner, though I still did not understand its meaning. She grew, if anything, more relaxed. Where the early sessions had carried a tension beneath her calm exterior, something I could sense even if I could not name it, the later sessions felt different. Settled, as though a great weight had been slowly, deliberately set down. I remember asking her once, during a brief pause between formal proceedings, whether she found these negotiations difficult. It was a foolish question, born of my own growing confidence, my own certainty that we had already won. She considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Every conversation has a shape," she said. "You just have to be patient enough to let it finish." I wrote that quote down in my personal notes, thinking it was simply an interesting piece of human philosophy, worth remembering for cultural study. I did not understand, not then, that she was telling me exactly what she was doing, in words so plain that I walked right past their meaning. Doran Kell, meanwhile, had begun preparing what he believed would be the final session, the moment where the Concorde's patience would run out and our full demands would be presented as an ultimatum. He was certain that 40 days of careful pressure had worn the humans down to the point of surrender. He spoke of it openly among the delegation, describing how he expected General Marlowe to finally break, to finally show the fear he was certain she had been hiding all along. I believed him. I want to be honest about that. I believed, with the same confidence as everyone around me, that we were approaching the end of a long and difficult negotiation, and that the ending would favor the Concorde, as every ending before it had. I did not know that General Marlowe had been counting down the same 40 days for an entirely different reason. I did not know that somewhere in the space between her calm questions and her measured silences, an entire fleet had been quietly, patiently, completely repositioned, waiting only for a single sentence to set it into motion. There was a moment, on the 18th day, that I have returned to many times since, turning it over in my memory, the way one turns over a stone looking for something hidden underneath. We had broken for a short recess, and I found myself alone in a side corridor with General Marlowe, both of us waiting for an elevator car that seemed to be taking an unusually long time to arrive. Silence stretched between us, the kind of silence that Thessians find uncomfortable, and humans, I was learning, did not seem to mind at all. I asked her, simply to fill the space, whether she missed her home. It was a question I had asked dozens of prisoners and diplomats on other worlds, one that usually produced some flicker of emotion, some crack in the composure I was trained to look for. She considered the question with the same unhurried care she gave every question in the formal sessions. "I think about it," she said. "Mostly I think about the people still there." "You must be afraid for them," I said, testing. "I try not to spend time on fear," she answered. "It doesn't get anything done." The elevator arrived before I could press further, and she stepped inside without another word, leaving me standing in the corridor, turning her answer over in my mind. I remember writing that exchange into my personal notes that night, describing it as evidence of a disciplined, perhaps unusually composed personality. I did not write what I now believe to be true, that she had already decided, long before that conversation, exactly what would happen at the end of these talks, and that fear had simply become irrelevant to a decision already made. There were other small moments like that one, scattered across the early days, each easy to dismiss on its own. She thanked the kitchen staff aboard our flagship by name after shared meals, a courtesy that struck several of my colleagues as strange, even inappropriate, given the circumstances. She asked, more than once, about the well-being of junior Thessian officers who had been reassigned or replaced during the talks, as though she were keeping a quiet accounting of every face she encountered. At the time, I assumed this was simple human sentimentality, a soft trait ill-suited to the harsh realities of war. I understand now that she was doing what any careful commander does before a decisive engagement. She was learning the shape of everything around her, including the small, seemingly unimportant details that most negotiators never bother to notice. She was not being sentimental. She was being thorough. I did not know, but I was about to find out, and so was every other soul aboard our flagship. The 40th session began the way all the others had, with the same wide, undecorated room, the same distant hum of ship systems beneath our feet, the same careful arrangement of chairs around a long table that had, by now, hosted nearly 6 weeks of talk without resolution. I remember thinking, as I took my seat, that the room itself had started to feel less like a place of negotiation and more like a place of waiting, though I could not have told you what we were all waiting for. Doran Kell entered last, as was his custom, flanked by 2 junior aides carrying data slates filled with what he had promised would be our final terms. He looked more confident than I had seen him in weeks, and I understood why. He believed today was the day the human resistance would finally crumble. General Marlowe was already seated when we arrived, exactly as she had been every session before, hands folded, expression unreadable, waiting with the same patience that had, by then, become almost familiar to me. Beside her sat two of her senior officers, a man named Peter Aldridge and a woman named Louise Faraday, both silent throughout every session I had ever attended, present only to observe. Doran Kell began his address without preamble. He spoke of the Concorde's overwhelming military superiority. He spoke of the fleet positioned beyond the colony's boundary, ready to advance at a single command. He spoke of the futility of continued resistance, the inevitable suffering that would follow any refusal, and the mercy that awaited full and immediate surrender. It was, in essence, the same speech he had given on the very first day, dressed now in more forceful language, wrapped in a false courtesy that fooled no one in that room. I watched General Marlowe's face as he spoke, searching, as I always did, for some sign of the fear I still believed lay hidden beneath her calm. I found none. Not that day. Not ever. When Doran Kell finished, he set his data slate down on the table with a sharp, deliberate motion, clearly meant to punctuate the weight of his words. Silence followed. It stretched longer than any silence I had experienced in all my years of diplomatic service, long enough that I felt the discomfort of it settle into my chest like something physical. I glanced around the table. Even members of our own delegation, Thessians who had sat through countless negotiations without flinching, began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. The silence had a weight to it that none of us had expected, and none of us knew how to break. General Marlowe did not rush to fill it. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost gentle, carrying none of the anger I had braced myself for. "I have listened to everything you have said," she began. "Not just today, but every day, for the last 40. I want you to know that I heard all of it." Doran Kell inclined his head slightly, mistaking her words for the beginning of surrender. "You asked me many questions during these talks," she continued. "About our shipyards, about our fleet's readiness, about our command structure, our supply lines, our internal disputes. I answered every single one of them honestly. I remember feeling a strange unease settle over me as she spoke, though I could not yet name its source. "What you never asked," she said, "was why I was so willing to answer." The room fell utterly still. I watched Doran Kell's expression shift, the first true crack of uncertainty I had ever seen on his face, though even then, I do not think he understood what was coming. General Marlowe rose slowly from her seat. She did not raise her voice. She did not gesture dramatically, or slam her hands against the table, or do any of the things I had imagined a human commander might do in this moment. She simply stood, gathered the treaty documents laid out before her, and folded them closed with slow, deliberate care, as though closing a book she had already finished reading long ago. "No more talks," she said. "Let the battle begin." I want to tell you that I understood, in that instant, exactly what those words meant. I did not. I understood only that something fundamental had shifted, that 40 days of careful, patient conversation had reached their end, and that the calm which had defined every session until now had simply, quietly, closed like a door. Doran Kell rose to his feet as well, sputtering something about the consequences of such a decision, about the overwhelming force that would now be brought against her colony without mercy. It struck me, even in that moment of rising panic, how strange it was to watch a man who had spent 6 weeks certain of his own superiority, suddenly grasping for words that no longer carried any weight. General Marlowe did not answer him. She did not need to. She simply turned and walked toward the exit, her two silent officers, Peter Aldridge and Louise Faraday, rising to follow her without a word, their faces revealing nothing of what they already knew was coming. Within moments, the room that had held 40 days of careful diplomacy stood empty, except for the shaken remains of our delegation. For a long moment, no one in that emptied room spoke at all. I remember looking around at the faces of my colleagues, Thessians who had built entire careers on the assumption that patience belonged to us, that we were the ones who understood how to weight an enemy into submission. I saw, on each of those faces, the same slow, dawning understanding that I felt settling into my own chest, cold and heavy. We had spent 40 days believing we controlled the pace of these negotiations. We had never controlled anything at all. I remember Vess Oren turning to me, his expression pale, and saying only, "She was never afraid." I did not have time to respond before the alarms began. They started distant at first, a low tone rising through the flagship's corridors, growing steadily louder and more urgent as officers rushed past us toward their stations. I remember stepping to the nearest viewport, still trying to process what had just happened in that negotiation room, and seeing something that made every certainty I had, carried for 6 weeks, collapse at once. The dark space beyond our fleet, the space we had watched for 40 days, believing it held nothing but scattered human patrol ships and a modest defensive presence, was no longer dark. It was filled with lights, hundreds of them, emerging from positions we had never detected, moving with a coordination that spoke of long and careful planning. I understood, in that moment, exactly what those 40 days had truly been. Not a negotiation, not a delay born of fear. A countdown, measured out patiently, deliberately, while an entire fleet assembled itself in the spaces between our questions and her answers. Every supply convoy that had requested passage through our lines had, in fact, been quietly repositioning military assets under the cover of civilian transport. Every colonial dispute that had pulled her attention away from the table had, in truth, been the careful redeployment of battle groups we had never thought to track closely, distracted as we were by the illusion of internal human disorder. Every sensor anomaly our patrol ships had dismissed as stellar interference had been the passage of vessels moving exactly where they needed to be, exactly when they needed to be there. She had built an entire offensive, piece by piece, question by question, hidden inside the very negotiations meant to prevent it. And we had handed her every piece of information she needed to know precisely where and how to strike, because we had been so certain that a frightened, disorganized species could never mount a threat worth taking seriously. I stood at that viewport, watching the human fleet emerge from positions we had never suspected, and I understood, with a clarity that still haunts me, that we had not spent 40 days negotiating with a desperate colony seeking mercy. We had spent 40 days handing a patient, brilliant commander every tool she needed to end us. The first strikes began within minutes of the alarms sounding, and I realized, with a cold and sinking certainty, that whatever calm had defined those long weeks of talk had been spent entirely, and what remained now belonged to an entirely different kind of storm. I will not pretend that I understood, in those first chaotic moments, the full scope of what General Marlowe had built during those 40 days. I understood only fragments, delivered to me secondhand through the panicked reports of officers rushing past me in the corridors, through fragments of battle data displayed on screens I barely comprehended, through the shaking voice of Vess Oren as he tried, desperately, to make sense of numbers that refused to make sense. What I can tell you, having pieced together the full account in the months that followed, from survivor testimonies, from captured records, from the official inquiry that consumed the remainder of my career, is this. The battle that unfolded above Kepler's rest was not the desperate defense of an overwhelmed colony. It was a precisely executed counterstrike, planned and rehearsed long before General Marlowe ever sat down at that negotiating table. The human fleet that emerged from hidden positions did not scatter in panic, as our war council had modeled for every previous human engagement. It moved with a coordination that suggested extensive rehearsal, each vessel understanding its role with a precision that left our own commanders scrambling to respond. Where our fleet expected chaos, we found order. Where we expected desperation, we found calm, practiced execution. I remember Vess Oren standing beside me at a secondary viewing station, reading the incoming reports with growing horror on his face. They knew exactly where our supply lines were weakest, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They knew exactly which sectors our reinforcements would need to pass through. They knew our response protocols almost as well as we did. I understood then what those 40 days of careful, probing questions had truly accomplished. Every answer we had given her, every piece of information offered freely in the spirit of what we believed was diplomatic good faith, had been folded into a plan built with patience and precision. She had not been gathering information out of fear or uncertainty. She had been building a map, and we had drawn most of it for her ourselves. The human colony's supposed defensive weakness, the underdeveloped shipyards we had inspected and dismissed, the modest patrol presence we had observed for weeks, all of it had been carefully curated, a picture painted specifically for Concord eyes, designed to encourage exactly the confidence that had led our war council to underestimate the true scope of what awaited us. I watched, from the relative safety of a diplomatic shuttle hastily prepared for evacuation, as human vessels executed maneuvers that our own tacticians would later study for years, unable to fully explain how a species so young to space combat had developed such disciplined coordination. Battle groups that Concorde scouts had tracked moving toward minor colonial disputes revealed themselves as the core of a carefully assembled strike force, converging now with devastating precision on the flagship that had, until minutes before, hosted 40 days of careful, unhurried conversation. I remember one particular exchange from the early minutes of the engagement, relayed to me later by a communications officer who had monitored open channels during the fighting. A Concorde battle group commander, realizing too late that the human vessels closing on his position had anticipated his exact evasive maneuvers, was heard asking his own tactical officer how the enemy could possibly know his ship's standard defensive pattern. The answer, though no one aboard that vessel could have known it in the moment, was simple. That pattern had been included, almost as an afterthought, in one of the many technical briefings our own delegation had provided during the negotiations, offered freely as evidence of Concorde military transparency, meant to demonstrate our confidence and goodwill. We had, in our eagerness to appear strong and unshakable, handed General Marlowe blueprints to our own predictability. I do not believe this was a mistake on our part in any single, identifiable moment. It was the accumulation of 40 days of small, reasonable concessions, each one harmless on its own, each one another piece of a picture she had been assembling with patience, I still find difficult to fully comprehend. I do not wish to dwell excessively on the details of the engagement itself. I will tell you only that it did not unfold the way our war council had predicted, not in any measure. Ships we had believed unprepared moved with practiced confidence. Commanders we had believed disorganized executed strategies that required months, perhaps years, of careful planning and rehearsal. And throughout it all, I understood, with growing dread, that every question General Marlowe had asked during those long, patient sessions had been part of a plan, set in motion long before our fleet ever arrived at Kepler's rest. I survived that day only because my small diplomatic shuttle was deemed unworthy of attention amid the larger engagement unfolding around it. I remember watching, through a narrow viewport, as our flagship's shields buckled under coordinated fire, as vessels we had believed invulnerable were forced into retreat, as the confident, overwhelming force we had brought to Kepler's rest was systematically, methodically dismantled by a fleet that should not, by every measure we had studied, have been capable of such coordination. I remember, too, a strange and unexpected clarity settling over me as I watched. I thought of the young analyst Vess Oren and his early observation that General Marlowe's questions had seemed less like fear and more like confirmation. I thought of her quiet words during that brief pause in negotiations, about every conversation having a shape, about patience being required to let it finish. I understood, finally, completely, what shape that conversation had always been building toward. It had never been a negotiation meant to avoid war. It had been a negotiation meant to prepare for one, conducted with a discipline and patience that our own doctrine had never accounted for. We had approached Kepler's rest, expecting to face fear and desperation, the same predictable emotional responses we had encountered on 11 worlds before it. Instead, we had encountered something far more dangerous, a commander willing to spend 40 days in careful, deliberate stillness, absorbing every piece of information we offered, revealing nothing of her true intentions until the precise moment she had chosen to reveal them. By the time the engagement ended, hours later, the Concorde fleet that had arrived at Kepler's rest with such overwhelming confidence had been reduced to a fraction of its original strength, forced into a hasty and humiliating withdrawal. I do not know the exact number of vessels lost that day. I know only that it was far greater than any single engagement in our recorded history against a species so young to space warfare. There is one account from that engagement I did not learn until much later, during the long inquiry that followed our return to Concorde space, but which I believe belongs here, alongside everything else I witnessed that day. A Concorde support vessel named the Ashwind, carrying wounded crew evacuated from the flagship, attempted to break away from the main engagement and retreat toward the outer edge of the system. Its captain, a veteran officer named Torin Vale, later testified that a single human cruiser broke formation to pursue them, closing the distance with unsettling speed. Toran Vale expected destruction. Instead, the human cruiser matched their course, held position at a cautious distance, and simply escorted them to the edge of the engagement zone before breaking away to rejoin the main battle. No shots were fired. No demands were made. When Toran Vale later asked, through intercepted communications during the ceasefire negotiations that followed, why his ship had been spared, the answer he received was simple. Wounded ships carrying no offensive capability were not considered targets. It was, apparently, a standing order given by General Marlowe before the engagement even began. One small piece of the same discipline that had shaped every other decision she made during those 40 days. I mention this not to soften what happened at Kepler's Rest, but because it reveals something important about the mind we had so badly underestimated. She had not simply built a plan for victory. She had built a plan with rules, applied consistently, even in the chaos of active battle, even when no one from the Concord side was in any position to notice or appreciate the distinction. It was not mercy born of hesitation. It was control, the same disciplined control that had defined every session at that negotiating table, extended now into the heat of open conflict. I remained aboard my small shuttle throughout the retreat, staring back at the diminishing lights of Kepler's Rest, thinking of General Elena Marlowe's calm, unreadable expression across 40 days of careful conversation, and understanding, at last, exactly what patience could accomplish when wielded by someone who understood its true weight. We had come expecting a frightened people begging for mercy. We had found, instead, a storm that had simply waited, with perfect discipline, for the exact moment it had already chosen to break. I was the only member of our original negotiating delegation to survive the return journey to Concord space. Doran Kell did not. Vess Oren, the young analyst whose early observations I had so carelessly dismissed, did not either. I carried their absence with me through every debriefing that followed, through every question posed by increasingly anxious members of our War Council, through every long silent night spent trying to understand how 40 days of careful conversation had ended in such complete and total defeat. The official report I was tasked with writing took weeks to complete. My superiors wanted answers. They wanted explanations that would satisfy a Concord leadership desperate to understand how a species so young, so supposedly limited, had inflicted such devastating losses against a fleet that had never known defeat on this scale. I wrote what they wanted to hear, in the careful, measured language expected of official Concord documentation. I described tactical surprise. I described an underestimation of human technological development. I described unforeseen coordination among human battle groups that our intelligence had failed to detect in time. All of it was true, in its way. None of it captured what I had actually witnessed. There was another account I began writing during those same long weeks, one I never submitted to any official channel, one I kept for myself, in the quiet hours when sleep would not come, and the memory of that final negotiating session played endlessly through my mind. I want to share some of it with you now, because I believe it captures something the official reports never could. Humans, I wrote, do not fear silence the way we assumed they would. We built our entire approach to this war around the belief that quiet, patient negotiation would eventually expose fear, would eventually crack the resolve of a species we considered emotionally unstable, prone to hasty decisions born of anxiety and desperation. We were wrong in ways that cost us everything. General Elena Marlowe understood something we did not. She understood that patience, properly wielded, is not the absence of action. It is action delayed, deliberately, until the moment it will matter most. Every calm question she asked during those 40 days, every measured pause, every quiet moment of stillness that we mistook for uncertainty, was in fact a piece of careful, disciplined preparation. She did not need to raise her voice to be dangerous. She did not need to threaten us, or posture, or display the aggression we expected from a cornered species. She simply waited, with perfect calm, until the conversation had run its course, and then she ended it, on her own terms, in her own time. I think often of the moment she stood, folded the treaty documents closed, and spoke those 7 words that ended 40 days of careful diplomatic theater. No more talks. Let the battle begin. I have turned that sentence over countless times since, trying to understand why it unsettled me so deeply, and I believe I finally understand. She did not speak those words in anger. She spoke them the way someone closes a door they decided, long ago, they would eventually close. There was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty, no trace of the fear we had spent 40 days searching for and never found. Only quiet, absolute certainty. I have since read every available account of General Marlowe's career prior to Kepler's rest, searching for some explanation of how she developed such discipline, such patience, such capacity for calculated stillness in the face of overwhelming threat. I found no single answer. I found instead a pattern, repeated across her service record, of a commander who consistently chose preparation over reaction, who valued the slow, careful gathering of understanding over the immediate satisfaction of decisive action. She was, by every account I could find, unremarkable in the ways our war council valued most. She held no reputation for aggression, no history of bold, decisive strikes that might have warned us of what she was capable of building, given enough time and enough quiet. Perhaps that, more than anything, is what allowed her to succeed so completely against us. We had studied humanity's most aggressive commanders, their most decisive victories, their most dramatic displays of military strength, and built our expectations around those examples. We had no framework for a commander who understood that the most dangerous weapon available to her was simply time, spent wisely, spent quietly, spent in careful preparation, while her enemy grew increasingly confident in a victory that had never truly been within reach. In the years since Kepler's rest, I have watched the Concord War Council slowly, painfully rewrite its own doctrine to account for what we encountered there. New protocols now require greater scrutiny of any negotiation that extends beyond a handful of sessions. New training programs caution young diplomats against mistaking calm for weakness, silence for surrender, or patience for fear. I have even been asked, on rare occasions, to speak before gatherings of junior officers preparing for their first contact with human forces, sharing what I witnessed in that negotiating room, so that others might recognize the warning signs I so completely missed. I do not know how much good it will do. Doctrine can be rewritten easily enough. Instinct is harder to change. I still remember the confidence that filled our delegation during those 40 days, the quiet certainty that we understood exactly what we were facing. I do not think any lecture, any protocol, any carefully worded warning could have broken through that certainty in time. Perhaps the only thing that can truly teach caution is loss, and by the time we understood the lesson General Marlowe had been teaching us all along, the cost of learning it had already been paid in full. I think, too, of something she said to me during that same brief pause in negotiations, weeks before the battle that would end so many lives, including those of colleagues I had known for years. Every conversation has a shape. You just have to be patient enough to let it finish. I understand now that she was not speaking of philosophy in some abstract sense. She was describing, with perfect honesty, exactly what she intended to do, and I was too confident in our own superiority to hear the warning hidden inside her calm, measured words. I have thought often, in the years since, about what might have happened if Farrell Ossa's outburst on the 20th day had been correct after all, if General Marlowe truly had been hiding fear behind her calm exterior, weighing surrender against resistance with genuine uncertainty. I do not believe this was ever the case, but I have wondered whether the outcome might have been different if any single member of our delegation had approached those 40 days with less certainty and more caution. Perhaps nothing would have changed. Perhaps she had already decided, long before we arrived, exactly how those talks would end, regardless of what we said or how carefully we listened. I will never know for certain, and I have made a kind of peace with that uncertainty, though it took a long time to arrive at it. I think, too, of the small, unremarkable moments that seemed to mean nothing at the time. Her quiet courtesy toward the kitchen staff aboard our own flagship, her careful, patient answer when I foolishly asked whether she missed her home, her order to spare a wounded ship carrying no threat, given before a single shot had been fired in anger. None of these moments seemed significant when I recorded them in my early reports. I understand now that they were, each in their own way, evidence of the same disciplined mind that ultimately dismantled our fleet. She was never divided between the calm diplomat and the ruthless commander. She was, from the very first session, both at once, and we simply lacked the framework to recognize it until it was far too late to matter. I do not know what became of General Elena Marlowe after Kepler's rest. Concord intelligence lost track of her movements shortly after the battle, and I have not been permitted to pursue further inquiry. my career having been quietly, permanently diminished in the aftermath of a defeat that Concord leadership preferred to attribute to unforeseen circumstances rather than any failure in our own judgment. But I have not forgotten her. I do not think I ever will. And if there is one thing I hope to pass on to whoever reads this account, whether they serve in Concord diplomacy, in Concord military command, or in any capacity that might one day bring them into contact with humanity again, it is this single warning, hard won through 40 days of careless confidence and one afternoon of devastating consequence. Do not mistake a human's silence for weakness. Do not mistake their patience for fear. When a human stops asking questions, when they close their documents with quiet, deliberate care, when they speak softly instead of shouting, that is not the moment to feel reassured. That is the moment to understand that everything you needed to know, you likely already told them yourself, freely, across however many days or weeks they were patient enough to wait for you to finish speaking. I met General Elena Marlowe only once, across a negotiating table that no longer exists, aboard a flagship that returned to Concord space carrying far fewer souls than it had carried away from it. I remember her calm eyes, her folded hands, her quiet, unhurried voice. I remember thinking, in my arrogance, that I understood exactly what kind of adversary we faced. I understand now that I understood nothing at all, until the moment she stood and spoke 7 words that ended everything I thought I knew about the species we had so carelessly underestimated. No more talks. Let the battle begin. I have carried those words with me ever since, and I suspect I always will.